This film will be a bit different compared to those I usually make. The form created won't be consistent from beginning to end, and instead this video follows the journey of creating a series of vase forms and all the things I learned throughout the process itself, which includes much failure, like you'll see towards the end, together with all manner of other things I learned along the way. Out of all of those I made, I was only happy with one of the final pots, but after all of this I know, when I make a second batch of these, that they'll be far better than those made in this video. The aim was to create a series of vases, which are thrown from two parts and are then joined together. I wasn't measuring the clay I was using to exacting amounts, but each lump probably weighed between 3 to 4 kilos. And this initial process is how I prepare my clay. It's called spiral wedging, and it removes any pockets of air from the lump of clay and creates a texture that's entirely smooth and even, which helps tremendously when throwing on the wheel, as any irregularities in this stoneware will only make the upcoming process more difficult. Each vase will be thrown from two of these lumps of clay, one part making up the base section, the body, so to speak, and the other lump is thrown into the upper section. I begin by centering the clay. This is the process of maneuvering the soft material so it spins directly in the center of the wheel head. I carefully cone the mass upward and then forcefully push it back down and compress my hands around the outside of the mass. Larger lumps like this can take a couple of minutes to center, but for smaller pieces it can take just a matter of seconds. I tend not to throw too many large pots. And if there's one thing I could use more practice with, it's throwing and centering larger vessels. So in many ways this entire process, from beginning to end, was exceedingly good practice for me, and these days I think I need to push myself to do more of that. With each cone up and down, the particles of the clay line up more so, and thus the entire mass becomes more plastic and more easy to throw. But in this very conical shape, the clay would be difficult to open up and form the base with. So before I create the opening and hollow this piece out, I first press the entire lump downward, and as I do this I'm leaning my upper body weight onto my arms, so not everything is being done by the muscles in my arms, and with clay that's relatively soft, you can use your own body weight to manipulate it quite easily. As I work, I keep my elbows tucked into my torso, which stabilizes them, and at the same time I constantly make sure that the piece of clay is well hydrated, as if the lump beneath your hands is too dry, your hands will simply stick to the piece of clay, when in actuality you want it to flow under your hands. Once the shape's correct, I'll wet the top and plunge 2 thumbs straight into the middle. I then place some extra water inside and use most of the digits of my right and left hand, which are pushed down to help widen the hole, and slowly I press them deeper and begin to form the internal base of the pot, which for these larger pots I want to be about 1.5 centimeters thick. Once I've pushed my fingers deep enough, I slowly glide them horizontally towards myself to form the base of the vessel, and thereafter I'll spend a couple of moments running them back and forth to compress the base, which can help prevent things like cracks forming in the bottom of your pot as it slowly dries. And here we have what is a very rudimentary pot. There's a hollow with thick walls, and my next task will be to gradually pull this clay upward so the vessel gains height, and to thin out what are very thick walls at the moment. For this initial pull, I'm not trying to get lots of height, instead I'm just pinching it up and thinning it out enough so that with my next pulls, I'll be able to more easily manipulate the walls between a wetted sponge on the outside and the pads of my fingers on the inside, which will push inwards on the clay from opposing sides, forcing the clay up. And in between each pull, I'll spend a moment just compressing the rim, together with collaring it in from either side, which just helps to keep the whole vessel a bit more under control. As I pull the walls up, I try to keep all of my movements very smooth and even. They're consistent, and consistency is what you want when you're throwing pots on the wheel, as inconsistent movements will leave you with walls that are uneven and wobbly, just like an air bubble might if your clay wasn't wedged sufficiently enough at the beginning. I push the clay in at the base and push out with my fingers on the inside to create a bulge, and it's this lump of clay which is then gradually squeezed up. And with each pass, the walls of clay become thinner and thinner, at the same time as the walls become more saturated with water, and thinner too, obviously. They slowly become weaker and weaker, and thus more care needs to be taken as the pot steadily grows taller. After each pull, I soak a sponge and I douse it over the walls both inside and out, just to ensure that the clay continues to be well lubricated. And with this next pull, I'll begin to push with more pressure outward from the inside, which bellies the form outward, and from this point I'll slowly begin to shape the pot, which for this particular vase I'd like to have a narrow base with two more distinct angular sections above it. Ultimately, I think it's these angles which gave me such trouble later on throughout this process, together with some unfortunate drying which caused the pots to lean over slightly to one side. Next time when I make these, I'll throw the angles in the form, but they won't be quite so distinct at this stage, and instead, once the pot is leather hard, it's at that point that I'll refine the shape and really turn the angles in. And generally I think I could have been just a bit more careful during this stage when creating the shape. And what I mean by that is I should have eased it out into these angles a lot more gradually, and I should have perhaps attempted to keep the clay to be slightly thicker where the angles change from one to the other, like you'll see more refined in a moment. But now the rough shape is there, I'll trim away some of the excess clay from around the base, which is done with a very old blunted turning tool which barely scratches the metal of the wheel head. I then take a sharp, flat-edged metal kidney which is offered up to the walls, and then from the inside out I push the clay out against the metal edge, which scrapes off a layer of slip and refines the shape quite considerably, although this isn't the final form of the pot, and the entire outside surface of these pots will be trimmed and further thinned out later on. A few days later, once much of the moisture has left the vessel and the clay is what we call leather hard, I then finish the rim to have a sharp triangular top which will fit snugly into the rim of the second half of the vessel, which instead of having a point like so, will be thrown with a crevice this point can sink into, thus hopefully joining the two pieces together quite securely. I then measure this top diameter so that I can throw the second component to fit it accurately. A wire is then slid beneath the pot, and then the body section of the vase is carefully lifted away, which is where I made another error, as I think lifting like this did impart some slight undulation into the form, and this I think would only become exaggerated as the process continued. When I make these next, I'll throw them on wooden bats. That way, when I lift the pots away, the shapes themselves won't be distorted. The next section is centered in very much the same way, and this part will be thrown taller with a rim that has a diameter that matches that of the previously thrown part. If I feel like the skirt of clay that connects the lump to the metal wheel head is undulating, I'll often just run a finger through it, removing the excess which may have been causing my hands to bounce slightly as they centered the clay, and then once again I clasp my hands around the lump of clay firmly before plunging my thumbs directly down into the middle. The base of the pot is then widened, and as the base of this piece will ultimately become the rim of my pot, I didn't care too much if the bottom was very thin. I'm actually throwing this component upside down, which means the base of the walls here will ultimately become the rim of the vase, and the actual rim of the pot at this point will be the section that scored and slipped and joined onto the body section of the vase. And whilst that all might sound a bit confusing at this point, everything will become a lot more clear as I show you the following steps. But, like before, these thicker reserves of clay around the base need to be thinned out and thrown upwards into the walls of the pot. I begin by doing a short pull, which is then collared in, and then I proceed to pull the walls up properly, which is really quite a slow process, and it certainly isn't one you want to rush, as if you do so, you'll either create throwing rings that are too prominent, which then distribute the clay into uneven bands around the walls of the pot, which then makes the consecutive pulls ever more difficult. So it's better to go slow, as it leaves us with a cross section that's much more even in nature. And once again, in between each pull, I collar the clay in, starting from the bottom and gradually working my way up to the top. If you don't do this, after each pull, the clay will naturally want to splay outward more and more as it's coaxed out by centrifugal force. So I tend to pull, collar in, pull and collar in, until the walls are as thin as I want, and thereafter I'll do the final shaping. Using a sponge on the outside for large pots is useful because as the walls can take such a long time to pull up, if you are using just your hands, there's a chance that your fingers and knuckles on the outside could become far too dry and they might stick to the pot. And so, by using a soaked sponge, it just gradually releases water as you slowly pull the clay up. It's a slow and steady process, and to save you watching the same thing over and over again, I'll show you the pulls themselves at a more sped up rate, which almost shows more clearly just how much the clay is lifted with each pull. As for the form of this piece, I want it to taper in from bottom to top slightly, so that it sort of resembles a chimney, but ultimately this piece will be flipped upside down and it'll become the top section of the pot. And now that the form is roughly there, I'll scrape away some excess clay from around the base, which is followed by a scraping clean of the slip from the walls of the pot, which I do just by running the sharp edge of a metal kidney against the clay. And in this instance, I'm pushing out more firmly with my hand on the inside against the metal, and just like when I was pulling the walls up, both of my hands move together in unison at a steady pace. And when I feel like too much slip has accumulated onto the tool, I wipe it away and then continue working. Then, for the rim, I press in a pointed tool to create a sort of V-shaped groove which encircles the top. Into this, the rim of the body section should slot nicely into, together with lots of scoring, which is when the clay is roughed up, with a serrated metal kidney, and lots of slip too, which sort of acts like glue. Here's a close-up of the two parts, this indent acting like a mortise, and this pointed section like a tenon. I'll let these two components dry out somewhat before I attach them. I don't want them to be leather hard, as otherwise making a really solid join will be quite difficult, but I will let them firm up slightly, just so the two parts hopefully retain their shape when they're stitched together, which in this case is a process I let happen the following day, and I left this part, which is attached to the wheel, sit out overnight so it could dry, and I think that's where I made another mistake, as it must have dried out slightly unevenly, as in the morning there was a slight undulation in one of the walls. So the next time I make these, I'll either leave the pot spinning very slowly overnight, or I'll cover them with plastic and control the drying thereafter more carefully. The following morning I spent a few moments trying to correct the slight lean this section now has, which thankfully was quite straightforward as I hadn't wired off this section yet, but inherently it meant that one section of the wall was drier than the others, and I think over time this got slightly worse, but I tried my best to correct it and forcefully pushed a sharp metal kidney against it to try and align it again. For some of these pots it worked better than others, and I don't know why I didn't try another method at the time, but rest assured next time I will. I then used a serrated kidney to roughen up the surface, gouging in hundreds of scratches, which the slip can permeate, softening up the clay of the surrounding area, which should hopefully mean the two parts join together more easily. I then load up a brush with slip and dab it thickly all over the serrated area. I dab as opposed to brush, as I don't want to smooth over all those scratched marks, and in some cases, if I think I have smoothed them over too much, I'll go over this slipped area with the serrated kidney once again. And I think it's worth noting at this point, the clay is nowhere near leather hard. In fact, these two pieces are still quite soft, and perhaps I didn't need to score and slip these quite as much as I did, but better safe than sorry. And in all 6 cases, the actual join was made very securely, which at least is one positive thing to come out of this process. And in many ways, I think the joining of the pieces was one of the most straightforward processes in the making of these, and I think what proved to be more of a challenge was drying them out properly so the pieces didn't move or warp, together with the actual glazing of these pots, which has to be done so carefully. I then take these two components and I join them, and the whole vessel at this point is upside down. And I know, before anyone makes a comment about it, this clay's particular colour and the orientation of the pot at this point gives it a somewhat priapic appearance. After the body section has been firmly pushed down, I run a wetted sponge over the join and firmly press a wetted finger over it too, blending the seam as best I can. The lower section is then separated from the wheel, and then I'll carefully lift the pot onto a wooden bat, which is where I may have made another error, as the process of removing quite a heavy pot may have imparted some distortion into the walls. So next time I'll make this section on a throwing bat, so I can then lift it away more carefully. The whole pot was then flipped the right way up, and then I scraped clean the wheel head, ready to place the pot back into the middle so that the base section that spans where the rim should be can be removed. And I think this is a rather strange way to go about it, but it did at least give me some good ideas about creating some fully enclosed sculptural pieces in the future. But for the time being, I need to remove this, as this should now be the top of the pot, and the outer walls of this section will become the rim of the vase I'm making. So I carefully remove this inner portion, piercing through it with a sharp potter's needle. I'll then reach a hand inside and I'll sponge over the interior seam, smudging the clay over the join and making it as secure as the join on the outside. I'll then cover these two components and let them firm up, and once leather hard I'll carefully trim the whole lot. But for now I'll also show you how I joined a few of the other shapes together, as I didn't join them all quite in the same way. Next time when I make a batch of these, I'll throw all of the different components on wooden bats. That way I can join the pots when the clay itself is softer, which I think in the long run would have made the process somewhat easier. In this instance, after attaching the second half, I noticed that the base was undulating quite a lot as it spun, so I trimmed it flat at this stage, as otherwise, if I flipped this pot the right way up, the form would have followed that undulation and the whole vessel would be leaning slightly to one side. These pots are now just about leather hard, but they're still too soft to trim, so I set them aside so they can slowly and evenly dry out. Another issue for this batch of pots is that I threw all of the components a bit too thickly, which ultimately meant I had to trim away a lot of clay from the entire vessel, and in 2 cases I trimmed one certain side of the pot far too thin, which meant during the glaze firing this portion crumpled with all the weight of the clay above it. One ended up collapsing and falling against the inside wall of the kiln, but that's something I'll show you towards the end of this video. And another one of the vessels just began to go, the thin clay wall folding, but not quite collapsing. Generally speaking, when making pots, I have a fascination of trimming them to be very thin and light, and I think sometimes I do take it too far, and it was very obviously apparent in the finished ones of these I made, as it's quite rare that the pots I make actually collapse due to a spot being trimmed too thinly. With this vase, I placed the top section onto the base, and with this pot I did throw the components on bats. And in the long run this was the vase that came out the best, both in terms of form and glaze, but that might have been just sheer luck. The only problem with joining the vessel with the bat still attached is how to remove it. I did this by taking a wire and sliding it underneath as close to the top as I possibly could. It certainly wasn't neat, and as the stoneware at this point was rather firm, it was quite difficult to drag the wire through without it bowing and removing more clay than I'd like. I think doing it like this also caused the pot itself to bend, perhaps unnecessarily so, in one direction, which meant that once again I had to re-center the pot as it span. And as different portions of the walls of these pots may have had different thicknesses, it meant that overall these pots dried out at quite uneven rates, which, once again, is another factor that can lead to the pots warping or moving against my will. Nonetheless, I then use a wet sponge to blend the seam, and I spent a good few minutes moving my hand up and down around this join to shift the clay from one component over onto the other and gradually melding them. I was able to correct some of the undulation in the wall by really firmly holding a rubber kidney up to the pot and slowly running it up the sides, which seemed to work, but it seemed to cause the inconsistencies to then be focused around the rim, which I'd then have to trim and correct once the pot's leather hard. And as these were quite thickly potted, they took some time to dry out to the point where I was happy to trim them, and for one night I wrapped the lower section in plastic so that the upper walls could hopefully dry out and match the base below. And this was a really bad idea, as my studio is quite drafty, and when I came in the following morning, a few of these were just ever so slightly leaning to one side. I can sometimes get away with leaving my mugs out overnight, but with larger pots like these I should have really been more careful. Throwing in trimming pots, glazing them and firing them, those are the obvious skills potters have. Yet there's a skill itself in knowing how to dry pots out effectively, and it's one that changes quite dramatically from studio to studio, to country to country. Even your raw materials can make a difference, and whether the kiln has been on overnight or not. And while you may be able to get away leaving some pots exposed overnight, others simply won't take it. It's learning through trial and error, and it seems like learning how to make pots is so very often like that. The next step for these though is trimming, and in this case that was a difficult task as there were some quite serious wobbles I had to contend with. With that being said though, it's amazing what you can get away with, although ultimately what I thought I was getting away with is what led to some pots collapsing. And that was for this simple reason, as a few of these pots had an inherent wobble. to them. It means I'd remove more clay from one side than the other, as I attempted to even out the overall form. This meant at the end that one side of the pot may have walls that are 2 to 3 millimeters thick, whereas the other side was being closer to a centimeter thick. And this meant, especially if that inconsistency was on the very lowest section of the pots, that all that clay above it would overwhelm that thin spot, causing it to crumple like paper, especially when fired exceedingly hot to cone 10 or some 1290 degrees Celsius. I trimmed these pots in both orientations, upside down like so, and from the right way up. The vase is held in place with 3 lumps of soft clay which are fastened around the rim, and then from above I'm applying downward pressure through a spinner tool to keep the whole vessel pinned in place. Once the rim of the pot and the sides of the vessel have been trimmed, I begin finishing the base. I trim away the wiring off marks which are left over from when the pot is removed from the wheelhead. I also very slightly bevel the outer edge. This removes what would be quite a sharp angle which could very likely chip once fired when the pot's moved around and put in place. High iron stoneware clay bodies tend to be quite brittle, especially too when they're trimmed thinly and they're reduction fired, so just softening that bottom corner does make a big difference, as it's very likely the part of the pot that'll be knocked around the most. I then use a metal kidney to burnish the clay smooth, before finally stamping it with my maker's mark, which is pushed carefully into the leather hard clay and is rocked from corner to corner, so that it leaves a clear impression. Trimming pots that aren't quite perfectly true can be a challenge. Sharp blades certainly help, and I really clasp the tools incredibly tightly in my hand, as I want the blade to slice through any undulation there is, rather than let the undulation take control and dictate where the blade is moved. Although sometimes that's easier said than done, and you have to make do, even if the pot isn't spinning perfectly true. And this view perhaps shows how off-centre the piece actually was, and in one way I was quite grateful I left so much clay to work with, as it meant I could trim these pots really quite ferociously. At this point, I wasn't really happy with these pots. I think it's always a bit demoralising trying to correct something that you've worked on really quite carefully up until this point. One part of me is telling me to stop, to destroy this pot and try again, and another part of me is urging me on to try and correct it, or to make something that's at least acceptable, even with its flaws. Typically that's not a position I like to find myself in, as I'd like to think I make all of my pots to the very best of my ability, and if I'm not happy with something usually, I'll just scrap it. Yet, at the same time, seeing an idea through from beginning to end can be invaluable, and I'm glad I did, even if I only ended up with one pot from this batch that I really liked. Once I felt like enough clay was trimmed away, I then skimmed this sharp metal tool over the surface, just to ensure they were nice and neat. The trimming of these pots produced a lot of reclaim. This is the excess material that's removed as the pot is refined. I keep a bucket directly to the left of my wheel, and as the tray fills up, I periodically scoop the excess directly into it, and these thin ribbons of clay quickly dissolve in the water. It quickly turns into a slurry, and these scraps are turned back into usable clay, which can then be thrown into new pots. Once the sides of these pots have been trimmed, they're removed from the wheel, and that's when I flip them over to do the base. Once the pieces have been refined to my liking and they're relatively light to carry, I'll set them aside one last time so they can dry out slowly to bone dry, so that they can be bisque fired, glazed, and finally reduction fired. One of the trickier parts to turn was the rim itself. Through a few of these I had to trim quite a lot of weight out from this portion, and I trimmed them from the top down so that the rims were level and didn't undulate too much. The tungsten carbide turning tools I use do have a tendency to chatter somewhat when used against clay that contains quite a lot of grog, and you can just about see echoes of that on the outer surface of this pot as it spins around. They're quite easy to remove though, and I do so by just running the flat metal edge of a kidney over the sides of the walls. It can take a few passes to be absolutely rid of them, and even if I do leave very faint echoes of them, the glazes I use should cover and hide them. Equally too, sometimes if the clay on the base is a bit too firm, it can be difficult to achieve a nice finish, and in that case I usually run a wet sponge over the bottom, which softens the clay again. Then I can burnish over it and stamp it, as per usual. Once each pot was finished, I cover them with plastic and let them sit like this for a couple of days, which allows them to dry out really slowly, which hopefully prevents any more warping or leaning over to one side as they dry out unevenly. And here they are, bone dry, and ready to be packed into the electric kiln for bisque firing. This turns clay into ceramic and makes the material much stronger, as at this point the pots are incredibly fragile. As well as making the pots stronger, it also makes them porous, which means they absorb the water like a sponge that the glaze powder is suspended in. The raw materials of the glaze in a powder form then cling to the outside surface of the pot, and it's this layer of powder that eventually melts, covering the pots in a veneer of glass. Sadly, I destroyed one of the pots, placing it inside the kiln. I knocked one corner of it against the interior brickwork, and it caused one portion of the very thinly turned wall to fracture, so that's one lost. Hence why there are only 5 going in instead of the 6 like there were. Sadly too, another one of these pots had a giant S-crack form in the base after it had been fired, which meant that only 4 of these were any good to continue with. But at least there were no cracks around the joins, and after being fired overnight and allowed to cool for 1 day, the vases could be unpacked, ready for their next stage, which is to have their bases waxed. These vases took up most of the 200 litres which this kiln can hold, which is about 7 cubic foot, although I was able to squeeze a layer of mugs in the very bottom. The vases are then centred on the wheel and a layer of wax is brushed over the base. This wax resist stops glaze from adhering to the base of the pot when they're dipped in glaze, and it probably saves a few minutes of cleanup per piece, as the bottoms of these pots can't have any glaze on them. During the firing, the glazes melt into a very glassy, quite soft surface, and then as the kiln cools down, the glass hardens. If the bottoms of these pots were covered in glaze, and I fired them in the kiln with the bases on the kiln shelves, then the pots themselves would just fuse to the kiln shelves, and really, the only way to remove them thereafter is to carefully pry them away or smash them off with a hammer. And the last thing I want is for the pot welded in place to damage the kiln shelf it's fired upon, as they can be quite expensive objects as compared to the pots, which at this point, in terms of material cost, aren't very much. A potter's raw materials are quite cheap as compared to say a jeweller or a woodworker. The next challenge with these was glazing them, and this was perhaps the step I was most nervous about, as there's no way I could dunk this entire pot in glaze in one go. So instead I did something which I usually don't like to do, which is glaze pots by first dipping one end and then the other. Glazing like that on pots that have one continuous outside surface often leaves you with a strange line where the glazes overlap, but I thought with these forms I at least have a very distinct point where I can stop dipping it, which is where the pot changes angle around the waist. You may also notice that I've placed my glaze bucket into another bucket. This is done as I didn't really know quite how much glaze dunking this form in would displace. Thankfully it didn't overflow, but if it did, at least it's caught in the bucket, rather than cascading all over the floor. I then flip the pot the right way up, place my hands inside the form and push firmly outward, and then I can dunk the bottom half of the vessel. I submerge it for 4 or 5 seconds, and then I withdraw the pot and set it aside. Now, in many cases you may see potters glazing the insides of their pots first, before they do the outside. The reason I do it the other way is because the pressure I'm pushing out with now, horizontally, is really rather a lot, and if that interior form was already glazed, I think there's quite a high chance I'd damage that glazed surface. So I do it the other way around. As for any glaze that had bubbled up into this interior part of the pot, I scrape it away, as when it comes to actually glazing the inside, if I were to pour lots of glaze inside the pot, and then pour it out again, the glaze would double up on this region on the top where there's already glaze, making it look quite thick and clumsy compared to how the rest of the vessel is glazed. So I just use a sponge to get rid of it, and before I glaze the inside, I'll wait until this vessel has completely dried out, as if I try and pour glaze into a form that's already saturated with water, then the interior form just won't draw in a thick enough layer of glaze. So I usually won't glaze the insides of these until the following day, and although the outside of the pot looks as if it isn't glazed, it is. That's just the colour it turns once it's completely dried out. The glaze in the bucket is a feldspatic dark green glaze, which is coloured at this point by 2% red iron oxide, hence its red colour. Yet, once reduction fired in my gas kiln, this same glaze will turn a deep dark green. I then pick the pot up, which is filled with glaze, and I carefully pour it out, rotating it as I go so the glaze can coat all the surfaces. And whilst this did work, for this dark green variant I don't think I put enough glaze in initially, as once fired the glaze on the inside was thinner than I'd usually like. This next glaze I'm using is exactly the same as the previous one, it just lacks the red iron oxide. You might not think that 2% iron would make much of a difference, but not only does it alter the colour considerably, but the glaze itself also coats the pots in a much nicer, more even layer. I call this a white glaze due to how stark it is at the moment, but after being reduction fired, it's more of a grey tone, and all of the variants will be speckled with dots of iron which are pulled out from the clay body itself during the firing process. And once again, I dip the top first, then place my hands inside and push out horizontally, and then I dunk the lower section of the vase. Glazing is one of those things where every shape needs to be approached in a slightly different way. For instance, the way I glaze my mugs differs from the way I glaze my bowls, and then there are vases and lidded jars too, which all need to be done in a slightly different way, as the way the glaze envelops them and flows off them when pulled out of the glaze changes, depending on the form of the pot. So whenever I am attempting a new form, although I do of course have prior knowledge from all the other pots I've made, I do sort of need to figure out a new way of glazing each shape. And just like it can take 2 or 3 attempts at making these kinds of vases before I get them to a point where I really like them, the same can be said about how I glaze them. Like before, I'm scraping away the excess glaze that bubbled up as I dunked it. I then use a damp sponge to go over this area just to remove the last specks of glaze, although glazing the outside and inside of the pot isn't where the glazing process finishes. Once both surfaces have been coated and the pots have been allowed to thoroughly dry out, I'll spend some time individually cleaning each pot so the glaze itself is smooth and even all the way around, and so there's absolutely nothing whatsoever on the base. Care and attention at this point really does make all the difference, especially as I make pots that are inherently really quite simple. The forms are straightforward and the glazes are very uniform, which means that any irregularities or discrepancies in the glazed surface become very noticeable. In one case I noticed that I'd left some turned trimmings down in the bottom of the pot, and instead of carefully scooping them out with my hand, I just used a vacuum cleaner to remove them, along with any other bits of glaze dust there might be, as they could interfere with the glaze as it's poured inside to coat the interior form. I then take a few jugs worth of glaze, and this is the 1% red iron oxide variant, which fires to a pale blue-green tone. Even with these 4 attempts, I don't feel like I figured out the best method to glaze these. Spraying the glaze on in a spray booth is an option, but to get it to the thickness I'd like, I'd have to spend an awfully long time spraying the glaze on. The other option is to find some more narrow containers, into which the entire outside surface of the pot could be dunked in one fell swoop. But even that would be tremendously difficult, as pushing such a large pot beneath glaze would require a tremendous amount of force, as pushing it in would displace so much glaze. So, for the time being, this method does work, and I think more issues arose because of the sections of the pot that were trimmed too thinly. After the pot is thoroughly dried out for a day or two, I'll begin to clean up the glazed surface of the pot. I use a finger for the most part, just to fettle over any stray drips or dots or specks. Basically any inconsistency I can find in the surface, I'll smooth over so it's flush with the rest of the glaze, whilst at the same time being careful not to wear the glaze down in any one spot too much. As with this green glaze, if there's a thin region, it'll fire to a sort of brown tone. The reason I wait a day or so before doing this is because the glazed surface, if it's still quite wet, is quite tacky, and if I were to fettle it like so, barely any excess dust would be removed, and it's that which plugs the holes and fills any gaps there might be. So after a day or so has passed, and all the moisture has left the pot and the glaze, the surface becomes just a bit easier to work and finish. With that being said, you can't treat all glaze types the same way. Every kind of recipe needs to be treated differently, and that's something you'll find out through trial and error. But I really try to take my time with this, and it tends to be that the more care and attention I give each pot at this stage, the better the final result is once the pot's been fired. The sides, though, are the easiest part of the pot to clean up. The rim is more difficult, as it has a greater tendency to chip, and it also tends to be the messiest area, as the glaze sometimes flows slightly over the rim, leaving some lumps and bumps that I need to tidy up. I can do most of it with just my fingertip, like so, and although it might look like I'm pushing quite firmly onto the glaze, in fact I'm really trying to be very gentle, as I blend this glaze around the rim into the walls of the pot. Basically though, any high spot I rub down, and in some cases I do also need to patch up some spots with some additional glaze, which works with this particular recipe, but it might not work with others. This feldspathic crackle glaze is quite fluid at top temperatures, and it can blend with itself and fill in holes quite easily, but there are other glazes I've used where any additional other tiny marks or corrections you try to make show up even after firing. The glaze around the rim though is very susceptible to being chipped. If I were to accidentally knock it against the roof of the kiln, or with even my fingertip, that's enough to cause the glaze to chip. So after these pots have been glazed, I'm exceedingly careful about how I hold them and how I pack them into the kiln, as there's nothing worse when you finally got around filling the kiln up for your final firing and you chip the glaze of a significant pot and you're sent back to the glaze bucket and workbench to painstakingly repair it. And this is painstaking and laborious work, especially in comparison to other parts of the process, like throwing and trimming. This is highly monotonous and highly repetitive, and I often can't wait to get it over and done with. Perhaps the most crucial section to go over is the midpoint where the two glazes overlap, as I dunked one side and then the other. So for this region I just use the edge of a knife, which is carefully held and moved against the pot, which I'm rotating on a banding wheel at the same time. When I use a knife to fettle glaze, I never try and remove too much in one go, as it's when I'm too vigorous that the glaze tends to chip. And after a majority of that excess has been removed, I go back to using my fingertips to blend over the area, to make the surface as smooth and even as I can. I give this lower section a quick rub over, and in this case I found a small speck of stone lodged into the surface, which was quickly dealt with, and excess dust was rubbed into the hole whence it came. I try to remove the worst of the pinholes in the surface, but I don't worry about the tiny ones, many of which you'll still be able to see littering the surface of the pot. In many ways I wish this process was faster, and it's always when I start to glaze my pottery and tidy it all up that I think I should start experimenting again to find something new. A glaze that's perhaps easier to apply or can be coated onto these pots in a thinner wash. Yet once the final pieces emerge from the kiln, I'm always reminded why I like them so much. And it's still, sometimes, after so many firings, so bewildering to see these pink and green powdery surfaces change into glassy blue and green tones. Removing these drips is perhaps the trickiest part of tidying these glazes up, as if they're scraped away with too much force, they'll simply rip themselves off the pot, so I tend to scrape each one down, bit by bit, until I'm left with a surface that's more or less flush. And once again, after the whole area has been fettled clean with a knife, I'll go over all of it again with a fingertip. Cleaning the bottoms of these proved to be the next challenge. Initially I tried wiping the bases on a soaked sponge like so, but I didn't quite get rid of everything, and it was very difficult to fettle clean a perfectly even line around the pot where the clay and glaze meet. So instead I tried to do something that was perhaps a bit more difficult, and that was to lift the whole pot up, which was then carefully clasped and balanced with one hand, which meant I could use my other hand to use a smaller soak sponge to clean the base. And from this view you can quite clearly see all the bits of glaze that need to be removed or tidied over. If I didn't do this step, the pot would very likely stick to the kiln shelf, and the line created where the glaze meets the clay would be wavering and rather messy and unprofessional, especially considering that the rest of the pot has been finished so meticulously. If, on the other hand, the rest of your pot was finished in quite a naive manner, be it loose throwing or prominent turning marks, then I think it's okay if the foot echoes that and it's a bit scruffy. They are handmade objects after all, and even mine, in comparison to industrially made ceramics, are very obviously still handmade. You can see the line I'm really taking care of, where the powdery glaze meets the turned beveled edge on the base of the pot, and I go round and round this part with a soaked sponge, making that connection as crisp as it can possibly be. And as the glaze is removed, I soak the sponge in a basin of water, and before I even begin this process, I make sure to scrub clean the table very thoroughly. That way, all the excess dust that's created can be scraped together and added back to this basin of water, and eventually, once this current glazing session is over, which may include several hundred pots, I'll sieve all this waste glaze back into my main larger buckets. That way very little is wasted throughout this process, unless of course the pot fails during the firing, meaning that the pot needs to be smashed or destroyed, and in that case the glaze is truly wasted. Packing the kiln is the next step, and here I am painting a protective layer of batt wash onto one of the kiln shelves these pots will be placed onto inside the kiln. This wash is made up from a mixture of 50% coarse alumina hydrate and 50% china clay, and together they create a highly refractory wash that protects both the kiln shelves and the pots. I think it's also worth mentioning that I'll never fire these shelves when they're still wet after being painted, and in this case I didn't fire the kiln until 2 days after it had been packed. First I place the shelf down, and then I carefully place each of these pots inside the kiln. Whereas in the bisque firing all the pots could touch each other, now these are covered in glaze they absolutely cannot, and every pot placed inside is positioned in such a way that there's perhaps 2 to 3 millimeters between them, as if the glazed surfaces of 2 pots do touch. They'll melt during the firing and they'll fuse together. This is a Roda KG 340 gas kiln. The 340 refers to how many litres the internal capacity has, which is about 12 cubic feet. In normal situations I can probably fit between 150 and 170 pots inside, whereas when larger pots are placed inside they reduce that number quite dramatically. This kiln is fueled with natural gas as compared to the one I previously used that was fired with just electricity. In the bottom 4 corners of this internal chamber there are 4 burners that jettison the flames inside. The flames shoot up on either side before being pulled back down through the flues at the bottom, which you might just be able to see as the tube-like structures in the very shadowy depths of the kiln. I should have thrown a number of tall narrow cylinders to fire alongside these, as there ended up being quite a lot of wasted space in this kiln load. And the more densely packed the gas kiln is, the better the reduction will be during the firing. Reduction is a state the kiln is put into after it reaches a certain temperature, and in the case of my firings that's 860 degrees Celsius. When it's initiated, it forces the fuel in the internal atmosphere to burn less efficiently, as there simply isn't enough oxygen for the fuel, which means I actively want to decrease how much oxygen there is inside the kiln. And if there are big empty spaces above pots, or lots of voids where air can be, then achieving a really strong reduction can be much more difficult. So these kilns need to be packed very densely. I'm looking to see if I can see the cone packs through these spy holes. Those were the 3 little coloured spikes you may have seen me place inside. They measure heat work and bend slowly as the temperature creeps past 1250 degrees Celsius, and I need to be able to see them through these holes clearly during the firing. So often there's some positioning and repositioning and checking and double checking, as if I can't see them it's quite difficult to tell when the firing is complete. And here's my mascot, sat beneath me as I work. Once the kiln's been packed, I'll close the door for the day before coming in very early the following morning to start the firing. I turn the gas on before igniting each of the 4 burners, and at this point I've opened the door again, as I don't want to light it with the door closed in case gas were to accumulate inside the chamber before being ignited. And here you can see the 2 sets of cones, both on the bottom shelf and the top shelf. And the reason I need 2 sets is because the temperature both top and bottom can vary so much during the firings. But typically the firing schedule I've developed and follow these days has them bend over more or less at the same rate. But just as important is the way you pack your kiln too. And if the pyrometric cones are really hidden from the flames, as they're encased in all sides by tall pots, and they may not give you the most accurate readings. But once all 4 burners have been lit, the kiln's door is sealed tight and the firing can begin, which lasts about 8 hours from beginning to end, and the kiln is operated entirely manually, as compared to the electric kiln, which can be programmed and fired automatically overnight. All I need to do for this kiln is very gradually increase the gas pressure and the air pressure to 860 degrees. At that point I increase both of those pressures quite dramatically, and I also slide the dampers that cover the flues to about halfway closed. This throttles how quickly the exhaust can escape the kiln, and thus the fuel burning inside, instead of being able to find oxygen from within the atmosphere itself, has to start seeking it from within the pots and the glazes, thus changing their colours. As the firing progresses, the temperature rises and flames begin to protrude from the kiln more and more. And finally, once the kiln approaches 1290-ish degrees, it's time to conclude the firing. But I don't follow what the pyrometer is telling me directly. Instead, I look through the spy holes and see the positions of the cones, as they measure heat over time, as opposed to just straight up temperature. And the pots need to be fired slowly, as the clay and glazes need time to mature and melt nicely. Once the firing comes to an end, I turn off the main supply and then each burner individually. I then let the kiln slowly cool down for a number of days, and then once the pyrometer reads about 150 degrees, I can crack the door open and begin to unpack. It It's always a nerve-wracking moment, even after firing this kiln dozens of times, especially so when there are large pots inside, as it feels like there's just so much more that can go wrong with them, and sadly, that would be the case with this firing. Everything looked fine initially. The large pots at the front looked good, as did all the other vessels loaded inside. The colours looked like they're meant to, and the temperature both top and bottom was very even. At this point, the pots are still very hot to touch, although I could probably remove those on the bottom shelves without scalding my fingers. Instead, I tend to swing the door open and leave it like this for 20 to 30 minutes before plundering the spoils properly, and that's when I noticed it. One of the taller vases at the very back had fallen against the wall. In a way, I'm very lucky, as the pot could have fallen inwards against the towering stacks of other pots, knocking them over like dominoes, which I have seen before but thankfully never in my own kiln. I then began to unpack, and this first piece was really the only fully successful one out of the whole lot, which in the grand scheme of things I didn't really mind, as I didn't have particularly high hopes anyway. Potters are very good at getting over loss. Breakage happens quite a lot with this craft, and it seems to happen the most during this final stage as the pots are locked away in a fiery chamber and exposed to incredibly high temperatures in a volatile atmosphere. Thankfully, the fallen over pot came out quite easily, as it only stuck to the flue a tiny amount near the rim of the pot, and you can actually just about see the speck that remains. Wow. And here's what I was laughing about: the slumped base section of a pot trimmed too thinly. I can almost feel how thin it is just by tapping it, and I've never seen anything quite like this. It looks almost like slumped skin or folded paper, not ceramics. Anyway, there's only one real thing I can do with this pot, and that's smash it to shards, which will at least be interesting as I'll be able to see the cross-section of the vase. Which, as you can see, was far too thin. This wasn't even the area that slumped. You live and learn, and I probably won't make this mistake again. In addition to the lower section being too thin, I think the upper walls were also perhaps a touch too thick, which ultimately must have caused everything to collapse downward as the temperatures reached cone 10. The smaller white pot also unfortunately just slightly crumpled, but it didn't quite collapse. But there were at least these two, and to finish them I just quickly grind their bases on some wet and dry sandpaper, just to remove any coarse specks of grog that might remain, as they could very easily scratch any tabletops or mantles they're placed onto. I just use various grades of wet and dry sandpaper, which I submerge in water, and then I place the pots onto them and rotate them in place a few times. If these were made from porcelain, I might polish the bases until they're glassy smooth, but with this stoneware I actually quite like the contrast between the glossy body and the coarse clay underneath. And that's it. A long journey finally come to an end. I'm most pleased with this pale blue version, but really the journey to get that final pot was heinously complicated, and I can't wait to throw another batch as there are so many things I'll do differently. I hope this video wasn't too much of a tutorial, and in a way it was just meant to show the creative process I went through when making these. I felt like I learned an awful lot, which makes for a nice change, as if I spend months making mugs and bowls, I sometimes don't feel as if I'm challenging myself. The pale green vase will be exhibited in the United States over the coming months, whereas I'm still not perfectly happy with this dark green variant, and maybe it's time I bought a pot home to use myself, but we'll see. Thanks so much for watching if you made it all the way through. Let me know if you did, and I'll see you next week.